So here we have the full underdrawing, which in my process for this project was essential, because if I have to learn a style and execute a style basically in the same shot, then I don't want to have to spend a lot of mental power, deciding who's wearing a hat and who goes where. I ended up just throwing the opacity way down on this full drawing, cropping in on the bottom right quadrant, which was intentional so that I could basically practice my foreground hatching right next to some midground and background hatching. So this is the area I focused on, and the blue that you see now was just a really light translucent layer underneath everything, and I could trace over it. Here we've got the contours layer, which turned out to be a surprisingly pivotal part of the look of this whole thing. I mean, I didn't really see it in the references, but when you start to construct one of these, you really learn how important the line weight and the quality of line is in conjunction with your hatching decisions. So you'll see here that there's a slightly, I went pretty basic, there's a slightly heavier and more full stroke on the foreground figures. There's even some in the midground figures underneath the light there. And then it just becomes a very broken and, light touch to anything in the background, which gets even more so when you see the final drawing when you see all the way to the back wall. Then it gets very, very light, a lot of air and light filling all this space in. So jumping right in, I decided, you can see those two people clinking their glasses together. I basically decided that it might be the most efficient to cast a lot of my midground, mid-tone on pretty much everything from midground to foreground. And then I would build on that with darker hatch work on my foreground. So what you'll see is me going basically left to right across those midground figures with single hatching, a pretty light line, a thin line, and just sort of practicing when to use my line as tonal information and when to use it as form information. So we'll start with this lady back here. This is pretty much exactly what you'll see for the next couple of minutes. It was me going through, picking which objects needed to get just a cast of mid-tone, and going through and applying that. Hair has been an interesting hurdle, and I know we brought it up in the references, but it was interesting to try this out. So basically the rule I discovered was you can't just cast a head of hair in single hatching parallel tone. It's a little too crude. All these examples I pulled together, they all do it like this, where they use the line to describe form and also tone. I can't figure it out. I mean, it's really, really incredibly sensitive to do that. You have to really have an idea of what this hair would look like in full color to reduce it down this way. So to me, the trick was I learned that basically you just got to shade it as separate locks of hair or clumps of hair. And that to me started to look pretty legit. So all those highlights on the top of the head, I mean, even if she was a pitch black, a brunette or dark-haired brunette, you still wouldn't, I don't think, cast that in any kind of tone. You would always just use your line to describe the clumps of hair and the flow of the hair. And here we are deciding on, how light to go with the shirt there. And it looks like she's wearing blue jeans, so we just kind of cast that in a dim mid-tone and taking some of those choices back. Oh, that's nice. That's kind of a nice combo of the form description and the tonal description of the hatching line. There's some on the bill. That's quite dark. Here we go. I tried to do some cross hatching. Again, too complicated. What I ended up figuring out at the end of this whole pass of midtone is that everything in the midground should probably only get single hatching. All of your cross hatching, anything that crisscrosses, is just so grating to the eye. It really gets too dark and complex to the eye. So I'm basically employing a rule on my drawing after I discovered this, that I would only do single hatching when I could for my midground figures and certainly for my background figures. And for the bill of the hat, it's another weird like moment where the direction you pick, it's essential to whether it looks any good. And when you're doing it, and I remember when I was doing it, when you're trying that and you're testing it in real time, it's weird. You start to only think like, wait a minute, there's only like two directions that I could even do that would make any sense. How come none of them look right? And then you start to figure out, diagonals, and you just kind of really shift around till it settles in. Oh, here we go, trying to follow the outside edge of the bill of the hat. I remember that not working either. I ended up just going with a basic diagonal that doesn't quite. It's kind of a short axis to the shape, but not necessarily to the form. So those two are looking pretty good. They're kind of nice and dim sitting in the background there. Nothing too dark. Contrast isn't too crazy. Moving on, let's see here. Looks like I tried out some folds and creases in the pants. That looks pretty good. Now, these two dancers here were requested specifically by the band. They are... I suppose this is an homage to this couple that comes to a lot of the shows. Here's that drawing of the hair again, which it's such a delicate dance. It can't look like a tangled rat's nest, but it also can't look like it's a helmet or something. It needs to really feel like it's locks of hair that are layered on top of each other, that are crisscrossing and intertwining with each other. So let's jump ahead to the shirt pattern, because this is one of two figures that I drew that doesn't just get a swatch of tone. They actually get a pattern. So here you can see me putting in what'll become a plaid pattern. And there is an example of this in our references that you might have seen, where the guy has I think they're checkered pants or something, and there's no actual hatch tone anywhere. It's just the pattern and the way it's distorted that's describing the flow of the fabric, which is super cool. So I'm doing the verticals first. I'll come back and do the crisscrosses later. But when you do this, I find it's extremely important. In fact, it's a make or break that you warp the pattern to the form of the flowing fabric. Otherwise, it just does not look any good. But this is looking cool. This is a pattern. This is like minimal lines that are somehow still really describing the distorted three-dimensional form. Going all the way down the sleeve there. Looking good to me. And then I believe this is where we start crossing the plaid. You could almost even leave it there if you just wanted a striped shirt. That looks pretty cool. Here we go, feeling our way across. Now this is setting up an actual grid here. So the way that the squares distort is essential to describing the three-dimensional form of his chest, basically. But once we get to the bottom, you'll see that it's going to be all line describing the form and the shading at the same time. It's really, really easy to make a mess when you're doing this because your lines are going every which way, and it becomes a lot about just picking a sort of a directional pull to the fabric. And in this case, it's pulling from her hip in the upper right corner diagonally down to the bottom left of the dress, which is more of a, kinetic description of her moving, in this swing position with her dance partner. But yeah, dresses, I definitely have done it before where it just becomes a tangled mess. So it's almost like a less is more situation, very much like the drawing of the hair. So yeah, this is what I'm talking about exactly. The upper right corner now is these just sweeping marks to help describe, okay, that's where the main tension is happening in this fabric form. Okay, I guess I decided against that. Oh, here we go, redoing it. Here's where we zoom in on the face. It's tough to know how much to give a face that's in the midground, but in the examples that you find, somehow these artists they know how to give a face personality even when it's only a few tiny little marks, even when it's just 2 lines for an eye, a little arc for the bottom of a nose. It's incredible to see them. All right, here. Well, let's take a look at the hair. Again, just trying to keep it to the rules I had discovered for myself, which is only shade the locks of hair as groups. So that means there should be frequent highlights that aren't getting a stroke, and then some pretty deep shadows on the far side of these locks of hair. That's kind of a nice moment under the hat where you can really see the pull of the hair going behind the ear. So I like that. That could work. I remember thinking it looks like a really crinkled pair of pants, but the problem was that it makes this kind of star burst come out of the guy's nose, which I thought might be a little distracting. So I remember taking that out and probably just going back to something a little more uniform. Here we go. I'm going to try this shirt again. Let's watch this. Let's see what I ended up doing. All right, starting with probably the harder shadows that are cast on this shirt and the main folds of it. Around the collar. Armpit on the back, which would get the darkest shadow. All right, and then it looks like we're not going strictly down the long axis of the rib cage. We're doing a diagonal, and then it actually kind of bends around the breast. So you can see when I'm doing this single hatching that I'm doing it in sections, which is very, very deliberate. And it's something I have learned from looking at these drawings, which is you can sort of napalm the whole thing and just do the entire thing uniform in single hatching from corner to corner. Or if you break it up, you can still get your hatching, but describe breaks within the surface of the form, which was a fun trick, and I do it throughout this drawing. Okay, now we're starting to hatch and, get oriented to the shading of these three figures, which are specifically different from everybody else. These three figures are not only in the mid-ground, but they are getting a super bright spotlight. So they're essentially completely filled with highlight, except at the edges where the light fall off happens. But then the light fall off at the edges needs to have a stark shadow. So this was a really delicate dance to do. The question was, how do you keep the contrast kind of lower for mid-ground quality, but also describe the harsh highlight everybody's getting? Yeah, there was that. See, now that I'm even seeing it in retrospect, I know for sure that it shouldn't be there. It's just too dark. Though we know that in reality, the arm would be casting a very dark shadow. I mean, it's right up against her stomach. So under a harsh light like that, it should be there. This is where you have to sort of, and this is where the artists of the time must have deliberately suspended the realities of academic drawing for the kind of new philosophy of brevity and this kind of new approach and look to how things are in space. It was a real it was a real mess in my head to sort of ignore some of the shading realities that I know to be true in the name of this new style. Well, new. It's like fucking 300 years old or something. There we go. This is a much more reduced down pass at the flannel and the one leg that you can see. It's this pass was much more successful. It's catching way more light, and the shading is much more I guess secondary. It's just not as dominant anymore. Looks like I had to give. Oh, this was a moment where I had to decide, should the shadow from under the flannel dissipate as it goes down the leg, or should it respond to the light overhead and be dark at the kneecap and dissipate as it goes up the leg closer to the light. So here we are basically starting to eliminate tone in the spirit of blowing out the highlights. And we're trying a couple of different ways. Here's the dark at the bottom attempt. No good. Skip ahead. Getting a couple of dark crosshatches here to try and get those, real pitch black, harsh shadows from this direct light. And into the pants. Pants have proven to be quite a hard thing to hatch. I mean, there's just so many ways to do it, and I'm still trying to figure out if there's a unanimous system for that, or if every pair of pants is just going to be a problem and going to take a little guess and check work. But for the most part, the process I've got for these pants is basically you start by getting the creases in there with a light line, and then you can decide if it's a dark tone, if it's a dark colored pair of pants, then you can cast the whole thing in tone, and start to build up, hatching from there. But if it's a medium to lighter pair of pants, you sort of have to decide if you just want to fill the whole thing with, folds and things. I mean, sometimes that's enough to tone a whole pair of pants, is just to draw out the folding fabric. That's a nice pair of pants right there. I like how that is started anyway. You could almost stop right there. It's just the major creases. It shows the clear tension of the pull of the fabric, and it does kind of fade down at the bottom without even touching the edge of the pool table. That seems to be a really legit move, very much in the style, I find. All right, here's where we're starting to investigate that atmospheric effect, the atmospheric perspective, as it's called. I guess I'm starting in the weirdest part of the entire thing, which is directly under this lamp, which is not only going to lighten up the background figures, but then I have to decide, okay, what happens when you get outside of the lamp. So I remember having to do some real actual testing with that, little back and forth on some choices. You can see the vertical hatching here. I think that if that didn't come directly from one of my references, then it was probably from my impression of of all of those references as a group. There's something that seems very systematic about it in the way that these late 19th century illustrators probably would have done. So that, to me, it's feeling like it just kind of was an instinct choice there. But it ended up sticking. I ended up doing pretty much all background objects in a vertical single hatch. Here's where we get outside of the range of the lamp, and that's where I have to change it up a little to indicate that, the light is now not affecting these people outside of that lamp. They are going to be shaded a little different. Some of these heads you see at the top I ended up taking out because once I had the full composition drawn, it was screwing up the scale of some of my other primary figures. I basically had to take these heads out because they were getting too small, is the short answer. So I'm hatching them now. I'll skip through this because some of those people didn't even make the final cut. Okay, starting with creases, just like you've seen me do with the pants and the dresses. Again, I don't know if this is the procedure that an artist from the period would have done, but I think I decided to start with this because it is a consistent characteristic of all of them. I mean, in all of those moments where there's fabric, the artist seems to be very deliberate with how they're drawing the folds. So I thought to myself, maybe I start there so that I don't neglect it or don't overlook it. This whole game this was a real guessing game of where to leave highlights and where not to. So I can tell you for a fact that a lot of this mid-tone that gets applied to our foreground people here, a lot of it gets taken out because it just, as I continued, I discovered what those forms needed. And, this was a start. This was sort of me. I'll skip through a lot of this, but this is me kind of just testing the waters just to see how it might go. So skipping ahead, looks like we're just casting the whole thing in some kind of tone, which later on I found out is a mistake. You wouldn't do that. You would almost use this part of the procedure to block out your highlight areas, the areas that are not going to get touched with any tone at all. You want them to stay really, really bright. The whole point of these foreground characters, I found out later, is you have to pump up the contrast big time, which means sort of like our three characters under the pool table light are super blown out with those big highlight areas. You have to do that with your foreground people too, almost as if they're getting a huge spotlight blasted on them. Because in a way they are. I mean, you'll see later in the sequence here that they get these really harsh shadows down on the floor. They get the darkest, deepest shadows away from the light to kind of model them. So what I did not know here is that the tone I'm casting on my foreground characters should be taking great considerations for big areas of highlight. But as I was just testing it out, it was kind of almost more of a study on, okay, maybe this direction will work, maybe a different direction will work. It was more of a directional kind of test, if anything. So a lot of these get erased. And I assume I probably am going to be sticking with the same procedure I'm developing, with creases first and then hatching kind of following suit with those creases. Mostly because what I've discovered is for the sake of the simplicity of your tone and hatching work, when you're doing fabric, again, you can use your line work, I'm finding, to describe the creases and shade the creases. So there's really if you can do that, then, a lot of that work is done. That's why it's kind of nice to start with that, and then you can avoid overhatching those by going around them after you've already placed them. This whole thing has become a big chase of efficiency. Of if this can be done, why do it in 3 hatches when you can do it in 1 hatch, kind of a thing. I don't have the experience yet, or kind of the toolbox in my memory yet, to know, what the most efficient routes are. It's a trial by fire for me, so I am discovering those as I'm doing them. But luckily, that's what this iPad is great for. Is if it's no good, I can wipe out an entire section, try it again with a more efficient system of shading and hatching. Now, just like the arms of some of our midground figures, what you'll see here is another moment where the atmospheric perspective is being applied to one person, to a single person's body, which means that the front leg, his right leg, is not going to get the same the back leg is getting a generic single hatching all the way down. It's getting it doesn't even change direction with the form. What I've noticed is that really does unify that into one arrangement layer. Just kind of sets that whole leg from femur to kneecap to heel to toe in one kind of layer behind the front foot or front leg. So that was a neat trick that I definitely applied several times.